Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks very much indeed for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's my first time at Native Advertising Days. Definitely won't be my last. I think it's a fantastic conference with really, really high-quality presentations. And I really enjoyed the awards last night as well. It was great to see such high-quality work being produced. So I feel like a bit of an imposter. I'm not really involved directly in native advertising. My background is thought leadership. I've been doing thought leadership for about 20 years. I started a company in 2011 called Longitude, coming out of the Economist Group, and I'd like to say that it was, all planned, that this was amazing timing on my part, because all of a sudden branded content was taking off. I think there was a bit more luck than judgment, if I'm honest. But over the past sort of 12 years or so, I've been growing Longitude, focusing very much on thought leadership. That's all we do, B2B thought leadership content. So it's sort of strategy, research, different forms of content, working with many, many large B2B organizations. And in 2018, the Financial Times approached us to acquire the business, and we became part of the FT. And this is where my native advertising journey really begins, because the FT has its own brand studio, and it has something called Partner Content, which is its own native advertising offering. One of the reasons for the acquisition was that we wanted to find ways to distribute our thought leadership content via FT channels, including Partner Content. And so over the past sort of 5 years or so, we've been working at doing that. It's not always been easy, I'll be honest. There's been some challenges. But what I want to talk to you today is about how my background in thought leadership, I think, although it's a slightly different discipline to native advertising, there's quite a lot of overlap. And some of the principles I'm going to be talking about, which are very much sort of thought leadership based, I think hopefully are relevant in a native advertising context as well. But first, the bad news. So we are saturated with content, and certainly in the time I've been involved in thought leadership, more and more companies are producing content. The one on the left here is one of my favorite but most depressing statistics I've ever seen. So this was back in 2014. The Washington Post reported that 33% of all content produced by the World Bank had never been downloaded, not even once. And that's pretty depressing if you're one of the researchers at the World Bank and you've been working for a year on this massively detailed paper, but no one's ever downloaded it. This is also quite an old statistic, but I think it's more relevant than ever. Between 60 and 70% of content produced by B2B organizations goes unused. That was, I think it was, again, probably sort of 8-9 years ago that came out, but I think it's probably even worse now, I would guess, because there is so much more content being produced. And bringing it back to my world of thought leadership, so we did some research at Longitude a few years ago, and found that 73% of business leaders thought that if you produce bad thought leadership, that can actually damage your brand and reputation. So it's one thing for your thought leadership or content not to be used at all. It's another thing entirely to produce it and then find that you're actually in a worse position than you were when you started. But of course, it's not all bad. And great content, as we saw last night and as we see all the time in this room, branded content has a really, really important role to play in helping companies achieve their marketing objectives. So in the FT, there was a survey of FT readers globally. 58% said that they consume branded content on a weekly basis. And these are very discerning readers. It's a discerning audience. They don't see any great difference between branded content and editorial content, provided it's high quality. And then 2 more stats from our own research. High quality branded content, 3/4 of business leaders said that improved their perception of the brand's ability to meet their needs. And that's really important because we've heard a lot about engagement with content. And of course, we're looking to get engagement with our content, but we're also hopefully getting more than that. We're hopefully getting content that creates value and that leads to a future buying situation. So this is evidence that good content can do that. And it makes clients think more favorably of your company as a result. And also, on the right here, a similar percentage say that high-quality branded content helps them to make better decisions. And again, I think this is important because in the B2B world, we have very long sales cycles. It can take 6, 12 months, sometimes more, for a company to reach a decision about who they want to work with. And branded content and thought leadership plays a really important role in helping them through that cycle, answering the questions at the right time and giving the information to the right people at the right time to help them along that journey. So, my contention, I'm going to talk about this. I've got 5 strategies as well, actually, funnily enough. I had 6 this morning, but my presentation was too long, so I had to take one out. My contention here is that thought leadership is actually one of the ways in which we can get from that first slide about the losers to the winners. And actually, thought leadership is a really, really powerful tool in a native advertising context. So I'll talk through 5 reasons why I think that's the case. But before I do that, I ought to define thought leadership because I've worked in thought leadership for 20 years. And I've never actually seen a universally agreed definition of what it is. And many people will tell you completely different things about what thought leadership is and what role it plays in marketing. Here's my definition, and I'm going to sort of break it down a little bit. So it uses a distinctive, authentic perspective to establish trust and authority with your audience that lead to changes in perception or behavior. And there's three important things here, or four actually. First, distinctiveness. That is our goal in thought leadership, is to create distinctive positioning and messaging for our clients. When you work with B2B organizations like I do, so let's take the legal sector. Most law firms do exactly the same thing. They look and sound the same. So what is it that sort of separates one from another? Well, actually, really good quality thought leadership can be one of the ways in which you separate yourself and you create a distinctive positioning in your market. The second piece is about being authentic, because it's an easy trap to fall in as a company to say, well, actually, I'm going to produce some thought leadership on this topic when you don't really belong there. So you're producing content about AI, but no one actually sort of sees you as a credible player in AI. So it has to be true to the brand, and it has to be authentic as well, and grounded in the reality of your business and your brand. It creates trust. That's the most important currency in thought leadership. We're here to build trust, because the buyers in B2B are making very important big decisions that could affect their career, that could affect their business. So they need to trust the companies they work with. And again, thought leadership is one of the tools that helps us build that trust over time, and that authority, that sense of expertise that you can be trusted to take on that project that the company is trying to purchase. And the most important thing of all, though, is about it leading to changes in perception and behavior. So I called my presentation Intelligence with Influence. Influence is what we're trying to do. That's the name of the game. We're trying to get our audience to think, feel, or do something different as a result of consuming our content. And that's the critical part, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I've got my 5 strategies that I think are from sort of thought leadership perspective that I think are really important. Some of this is quite B2B centric, so apologies to the B2C people in the room, but hopefully you can bear with me. The first thing is, in the B2B world, our audiences are extremely complex. You're not just dealing with one person who's making a decision and signing it off, and that's the end of it. You've got multiple people who are involved in that decision, buyers and influencers. So we did some research a couple of years ago. We found that on average, there are 9 senior executives involved in a major purchasing decision, and I've seen situations where there's many, many more than that. So that's 9 people on average that you've got to influence. 9 people who've got different agendas, different perspectives. They're at different stages of the buyer journey. And you've got to figure out who those people are and what they care about and what matters to them, and the kind of questions they have on their minds. It's very complex, and there's a sort of lazy generalization very often in B2B content where we say, we're trying to reach the C-suite. I don't know who this C-suite is. It's not like some sort of single entity. There are different people here with different agendas and different views, and we have to understand those agendas in order to create effective content. The second thing is that we've got this kind of complex buyer group, but also these individuals at very, very different stages of their buyer journey or the audience journey. And all the way from people who actually don't even know they've got a problem in the first place, let alone that you're the right person to solve that problem. And so we often talk about problem finding rather than problem solving, and actually good thought leadership should help you find your problem, actually, and diagnose your problem, not just solve it, which is actually often the easy part. And as you move through, you're going through these different stages, and you've identified your problem, but you're not quite ready to explore solutions to it. Then you're sort of thinking, well, actually, we do need to solve this problem, so I need to find someone who can help me do that. And then you're building consensus across that big buyer group, validating that approach, engaging your suppliers, and finally kind of choosing somebody. So that's why it's such a long cycle. That's why it takes 9 to 12 months, and that's why you've got so many different people involved. Yeah, this was mentioned yesterday, actually, I think in the LinkedIn presentation. This 95-5 rule, I think this is the LinkedIn B2B Institute, came up with this idea that actually at any one point, only 5% of your audience is on the sort of cusp of buying from you. 95% of your audience is nowhere near that point. And yet most companies act as though it's the other way around. A lot of their content is so focused on the point of purchase, but actually ignores all these people who are kind of way earlier in the journey. So we need to kind of cater for those people, answer those questions, nurture them along that journey to get to the point where they are ready to purchase. And that takes time, that takes effort. It's not a one and done. My second principle is about thinking long-term and focusing on the right metrics. So I'd say that metrics and measurement in thought leadership is probably the most complicated area of all. It's the area I get asked about the most, and I wish I had all the answers. I really do, but I don't. But it's something we spend a lot of time looking at. But also this point about long-term, because I think the real value from thought leadership comes from a long-term focus. That can be a problem in companies because they're looking for quick results, they're looking for quick wins, but that's not always going to be possible. In fact, you're looking at long-term brand building, the value you get from that comes over quite a long period of time. So it does take trust and commitment to invest in thought leadership because you might not feel the benefits immediately. But there are problems with measurement, and there are four, and there's probably many more than this actually, but there's four that I think about a lot. The first is aligning expectations. So I talked about this kind of complex buyer group and all these individuals who've got different agendas. That's also true when you work with clients on thought leadership projects. Our clients are usually marketing directors, but we also deal with comms people, we deal with commercial people, we deal with leadership, finance, procurement, all these different stakeholders who are involved, all of whom have got slightly different views about what thought leadership's for, what they should be looking to get out of it, and how they're going to evaluate success. So the first step is trying to align those expectations and get a clear view of what you're trying to achieve. The second thing is this point about thinking long-term. I think we always default too much to a focus on short-term metrics and short-term benefits. I understand why that happens, but actually it means that in B2B, the brand building aspect gets sort of somewhat ignored. It's getting better, I think. I think there's more evidence and there's more understanding of the value of building brands, but it's taken time. But you do need to think long-term, and that does take convincing, particularly people in the finance department who are looking for a quick return on investment. The third challenge is around attributing value. So how do you know if a piece of thought leadership's actually generated a sale or it's generated a brand uplift? How can you isolate the impact of a piece of content on that improvement in growth or in brand equity? It's really, really difficult. I would say it's probably impossible, actually, because there are so many other factors that affect that sale, so many other factors that affect that brand value. So attributing value and sort of isolating that impact, I think, is extremely challenging. And the final challenge is getting the right data. So in an ideal world, we'd work with companies who have CRM systems which are perfectly and religiously filled in. We'd know exactly when a piece of thought leadership led to a commercial conversation and led to a sale. The reality is that never happens, and actually getting that data back to justify the investment and prove it is not often easy. But we did have a go at sort of thinking about measurement in a thought leadership context. So a few years ago, at Longitude, we produced a report called Proving Our Value, where we tried to we interviewed loads of marketing directors and said, well, how do you prove the value of thought leadership, and what are the ways you think about it? And although we didn't get any kind of silver bullet answer to say, well, actually, we've cracked it, we did realize that there were sort of three elements to this that, that companies think about that are worth exploring. The one at the bottom of the pyramid is alignment. So this point about aligning expectations, if you get that right, and you've got commercial, marketing, communications, all the different stakeholders involved in a piece of thought leadership aligned around what you want to do and have buy-in for it and support it, they'll be more likely to take it out to market. Your commercial team will take it out to their clients. Your leadership will use it in speeches and presentations, and that amplifies the impact of what you're doing. So one of the areas of measurement that we focus on is, well, you need to look at that. How many times is that piece of thought leadership being used to trigger a sales conversation? How many times is it being used in a pitch, in a proposal, in a speech, in an opinion piece? All of those things should be measured. All of those things are important and incredibly valuable as well. The middle layer is our sort of traditional metrics. Our sort of dwell times, our downloads, our bounce rates, and all those sorts of things, which certainly have value, and I wouldn't say they don't have value, but I think they get too much emphasis, and certainly in a thought leadership context, because they're quite short-term in nature, and I think there's a tendency to focus on things that are easy to measure rather than things that actually really matter. The top of the pyramid is the most important from our perspective, which is about influence. I've said this already, that I think the goal of good thought leadership is to create influence and impact. Unfortunately, that's quite difficult to measure, but there are several areas in which we do focus on that. One area of influence that's incredibly important in thought leadership is PR. So if our content is interesting enough and valuable enough for journalists to pick it up and write about it for their audiences, then we know we're onto something, and we know that we're kind of creating something that's influencing the agenda in some way. So that's a really good metric. The second metric is that where possible, we do need to understand where thought leadership is being used to influence sales conversations. We're not taking the credit for it. We're not saying that thought leadership generates sales, but if it's used to open doors and it's used to start conversations that wouldn't have otherwise happened, then that's a really, really powerful thing that we ought to be valuing. And the third thing is, when we did the interviews for this report, one of the companies we interviewed was McKinsey, and they have a really interesting approach to how they evaluate the effectiveness of their thought leadership, and obviously they're one of the sort of main players in this space. So what they're looking for is a relationship between exposure to their content and perception of their brand as an expert in what they do. And so through their brand surveys, they're exploring how much people are exposed to their content, and if they're exposed to more content, are they more likely to perceive McKinsey as an expert in those topics? And ideally, you want a straight line correlation between those two things. More exposure, greater perception of expertise, because perception of expertise builds trust, builds authority, and ultimately leads to commercial conversations. So the third strategy that I've learned certainly a lot in my time at the FT is sort of thinking holistically and being multi-channel. So before we were acquired by the FT, we produced content, we handed it over to our clients, and then they kind of distributed it, and we didn't really get involved in that. Now we're involved with the FT. The partner content channel is one way in which we take content to market. FT Live, the events division, is another channel that we take content to market as well. But when we work with each of those teams, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that they tend to be a bit siloed. So advertising, people think advertising, events, people think events. And actually, we sort of come in and say, well, actually, if you're going to do a big investment in research and strategy and content, you need to get value out of that. You can't just use one channel. You've got to think across all of the different channels that you can potentially use and ensure that you maximize the value of that investment. Otherwise, it's a very, very expensive way of getting reach and getting coverage. So when we're looking at thought leadership sort of calendars, if you like, for clients, most of them start off with doing the annual research report, the big flagship report that you all have seen. And this is great, and this is our bread and butter. We do this for many, many companies. The problem with the annual flagship report is that you get a lot of impact in a short period of time, but it dissipates very quickly, and then you're back at the beginning again, and you've got this sort of endless cycle of building impact, and you're not creating those memory structures with your audience because you're not staying front of mind. So we're always looking at ways of taking an investment in thought leadership and applying it and using it in different channels. Events via FT Live for us has been a great channel because you can use research and content and thought leadership to start debates, have conversations, have a dialogue with the audience in a way that perhaps you can't do with a sort of a static report. We also want to make sure that we are getting the value out of a piece of thought leadership and using it in different ways. So that investment of research, taking it out and using shorter reports, more tailored content, regional, sector, different focuses is really important. And we build that up with agile monthly content that's more topical as well. So that's our goal, is very much to ensure that we've got a packed content calendar, investing in good research and strategy, but then using it as much as possible across a variety of different channels, across a full range of different formats, because everyone has different preferences at any one time in terms of the content they want to consume. My fourth principle, if you like, is that good content isn't there just to inform people. It's there to influence and inspire. I think a lot of content does just inform people, it's just information, but actually does it change behavior? In many cases, no. So I think a good test of thought leadership content is that it's influencing the audience and it's inspiring them in some way. So often when we start with working with companies, there is this huge gulf between what they want to say and what we think the audience wants to hear. Most companies are so steeped in what they do that they kind of can't sort of think about what the audience really is relevant to that audience, and they think that the audience is going to be very interested in what they have to say. So the first thing you have to do is try and bridge that gulf and ensure that the message that a company wants to communicate is also one that the audience wants to hear. And the closer we bring those things together, the more effective the campaign is. This it's taken from a Harvard Business Review article, actually, which I found quite inspirational for me. It's called B2B Elements of Value, and it was written by some Bain consultants. And actually, it was all about the factors that drive B2B purchasing behavior. And what they found was that there were these sort of 5 different stages, or these 5 different areas. And what happens with most companies when they're selling things is that they focus on the bottom half of the pyramid. Does this product or service make it easier for me to do business? Does it have functional value? Does it meet certain table stakes, compliance requirements, et cetera, et cetera? And that's sort of the traditional way of selling. And it's also the traditional way of doing thought leadership, actually. There's a lot of parallels between the two things. And what we've found is that a bit like in the B2B selling environment, in the thought leadership environment, we need to be focusing on the top of the pyramid, which is where we get most value and get most impact. So the second top area is the individual value. So first of all, when we're thinking about audiences and what they care about, in B2B, there's this I don't know why, but this sort of crazy thing that people think that B2B buyers are, well, A, they're buyers, not people, and B, that they're wholly rational individuals rather than people with emotions, sort of hopes, fears, dreams, all this sort of stuff. So the first thing you have to do is think about your audience as people. It sounds obvious, but it doesn't actually happen all that often in B2B. It's getting better, but it doesn't happen all that often. So Content needs to focus on the individual and answer the individual's questions and focus on the individual's hopes and aspirations and allay the individual's fears. That's the first thing. But the best content of all, I think, focuses on this top layer of the pyramid, which is about inspirational value. So the most successful, the most effective content that we've produced and that we've seen doesn't just inform, it doesn't just influence, it inspires. So it's about inspiring change. It's about inspiring you to have a better business, to do better for society, to do better for the environment. That's where the power really comes from good thought leadership, and it's also what your audience cares about the most. So I've got a video, which my colleague here, my assistant, is going to just play. Just sort of just bring some of this to life. So this is a project that we did for Fujitsu called Sustainability Transformation in Action. And it's a good example of one that brings together all the strands that I've been talking about. This is the partner content page on FD.com. It had a sort of content hub with all these different articles talking about it. Essentially what the research did was identify that companies have a lot of ambitions about sustainability, but there's not much action. And so it was this kind of gap between ambition and action that we were exploring in the research. And we identified a group of companies that we called the change makers, who had sort of certain attributes that meant that they were much further along than their peers in achieving good outcomes from sustainability. So this was the partner content piece. There was lots of data visualization. It was very, very engaging content. We also had a series of events via FD Live that were used to take it out on the road and have conversations with chief sustainability officers. And we also had content on Fujitsu's own site. So it was a multi-channel campaign, really successful. Fujitsu had just launched this new brand called Uvance for the first time, and it delivered real impact for them in terms of getting that brand out there, getting it known, but also generating commercial conversations as well. So my final fifth principle was about simplicity. And I think in thought leadership, in branded content, there's always a tendency to cram something with more and more messages because you have them and because there's so many different people involved that doing anything by committee becomes a real problem because everyone wants to get their message in there. So you end up with a sort of very, very complex report or complex content that's trying to communicate lots and lots of things at the same time. And there's a reason why that is a challenge. So this is something I borrowed from Kantar Millward Brown. Actually, it's to do with advertising rather than thought leadership. But they did some research about the extent to which messages land with people. The more messages you put in an advert, the less impactful they are. So if you have one message in a piece of advertising, 100% of people will recall that 24 hours later. If you have two messages, 65% will recall the first message later and 65% the second. And it goes down, more messages, less recall. So this is a trap that in a thought leadership world that a lot of people fall into, is to trying to communicate lots and lots of messages. But this is the problem, they have less impact. So my final slide, simplicity. So that's the first stage. I did a report a couple of years ago called Influence and Impact. And one of the things that I included in there was how you get attention for your content, because often it is a battle for attention. I started off by saying that we're saturated with content. There's more and more companies producing content. The first battle you have to win is getting someone's attention in the first place. So simplicity is one of the ways in which you do that. There are three others that I just want to touch on. Second is urgency. So when you're producing content and thought leadership, the question I always ask is why now? Why does the audience care about this now? Why is this relevant to them? What questions are they answering that they have on their mind? If it's not urgent, because we're quite short-termist in nature as humans, and it's not something that's a really pressing item on the agenda, it won't get the attention. The third piece is that it has to be relevant. There's always a bit of a trade-off, I think, between reach and relevance in content. You want to reach as many people with your content as possible, but you also need to ensure that that content is relevant to your audience. So finding the balance between those two things takes work and it takes effort. It's not easy, but it can also be done through a campaign of content that's tailored at different audiences, big kind of global pieces that then cascade down into more tailored, relevant pieces for particular sectors or particular roles. And the final thing, because it's sure, and I had to make it spell S-U-R-E, is eye-opening. I mean surprising. Surprising content, provocative content is really, really powerful and really important. But actually in the B2B space, it's quite rare. And I think the reason is, often when you start out on a project with a client, they go, yes, we definitely want to say something provocative. We definitely want to have a controversial message out there. But as the project goes on, that gets dialed back, and you get more and more people saying, well, actually, we better not say that because it might upset somebody. And so those provocative, surprising messages get sort of watered down and as a result, the content is less impactful. But I think it's really important, and I would always advise this to companies we work with: hold your ground, say something provocative, say something that is original and new and distinctive. So, in the spirit of my point about sort of simplicity, I know I've communicated a lot here, so I've completely broken that rule, but the message I want you to go away with is that thought leadership and native advertising, I used to think they were kind of separate things. I used to think they were kind of separate marketing disciplines that didn't have much overlap. The past few years has taught me that they have quite a lot of overlap, and they can be really, really good companion pieces to create very impactful content campaigns. Thank you very much.